Hi everyone, my name is Elias Zenkich and I'm a senior at the Wharton School concentrating in finance and legal studies. And today I'm going to be talking about my research that I've been conducting over the past few months regarding executive compensation. So this topic really began to interest me when I initially learned about the rapid growth of compensation in high school. And as the overeager high schooler that I was, I really wanted to explore the incentives that pervaded the actions taken by different firms in terms of compensating their executives in different manners, and also the different incentives that managers have to potentially influence that compensation itself. And so I'll just start with a brief overview of exactly what I've been researching and how the different findings can be useful for researchers, corporations, and even shareholders moving forward. So basically, executive compensation is exactly what it sounds like. It's the amount of compensation that is given to the executive of a firm for basically occupying an executive role in a given year. And this compensation has six major components. The first component really is just this cash-based compensation, which you can think of as the base salary given to a CEO. Usually this is defined in advance and makes up a sizable portion of the compensation, but not its entirety. The second part of it is bonuses. Usually these are cash bonuses given to executives and sometimes depend on different performance measures that firms use to assess how effective the executive is being in terms of guiding the firm. Now, the third one is the granting of options, which are effectively the granting of these different securities that these executives can use to buy the company's stock at a pre-specified price in a certain amount of time in the future. Additionally, there are also stock grants, where the firm simply gives the executive a varying amount of shares of stock at the company in order to try and align his incentives and maximize that share price moving forward. Additionally, there are non-equity compensation, which is effectively a catch-all for just different forms of compensation that don't really fall into the equity bucket, like deferred compensation and other forms of compensation like that, that aren't necessarily tied to either cash or stock. And then the last bucket is just all other compensation, which kind of includes the executive perks that people can have, such as using corporate jets, getting reimbursed for travel, and things like that. And so all of these different components aggregated together make up the total compensation that an executive receives in a given year. Now, where my research really begins to take a deep dive and become a bit more nuanced is that I analyzed the change in executive compensation if a firm implemented a takeover defense in a given period. So, just a summary of what takeover defenses are. A takeover defense is an item that makes it incrementally more difficult for a firm to acquire a target firm. And so you could think of these as just items that a corporation will put in to make it less likely that their company becomes acquired. These take on various forms. So a couple like examples of forms that I can give you. One example is a golden parachute, which directly relates to CEOs and other executives, where executives are paid a very large payout in the event of an acquisition of their firm. So you can think of this as making it more expensive than simply buying a company's stock to acquire it. These acquiring firms would effectively be contractually binded to pay these executives an exorbitant sum in order to consummate the takeover of that firm. And then additionally, there's another one called a poison pill, where the firm basically reserves the right to issue additional shares at a price far below the market price to their existing shareholders in order to dilute a potential acquirer that isn't necessarily granted the approval of the board of directors. And so this makes it incrementally more expensive because the stock that they have accumulated simply equates to a lower percentage than they had initially thought it would, and makes it far more expensive to actually consummate that takeover. And so what I found through my research is that when a firm implements a takeover defense in a given period, compensation of their executives increases far more rapidly in the period following the implementation of that takeover defense than it did on average. So, for example, the actual growth rate in total compensation for executives averages about 6% after the implementation of a takeover defense, whereas before the implementation of a takeover defense, or just more generally, the average growth rate is more around 4%. So you can think of this as about a 50% appreciation in the total growth rate of total compensation for these executives. Now, moreover, another interesting finding is that the stock awards and bonuses grew at 14% in comparison to their 9% and negative 7% growth rates that were associated with these different forms of compensation when a takeover defense was not implemented during a time period. So you can see that a takeover defense significantly predicts a change in the form and total of compensation being given to these executives in their just compensation packages more generally. And so this is important for three primary reasons. The first reason is that executive compensation is largely supposed to be viewed as an independent exchange between the board of directors, compensation consultants, and the actual executive. executives aren't necessarily viewed as having the leeway to kind of influence the board of directors in terms of approving higher compensation packages. But because a takeover defense predicts that these executive compensation packages will grow in size, that's really important to explore because it means that one, these executives might be having influence over their compensation packages more generally, and two, because takeover defenses are simply beneficial for executives as they have increased job security and things like that, it's really important to explore the influence that these managers might be having over their firms more generally. Because if the underlying assumption in the market today is that these executives are at an arm's length exchange with the board of directors and compensation consultants in terms of setting their compensation, that might not actually hold true if they're able to influence the actions of a firm. The second, if a company boards are not placing shareholder interests first, it's very important to explore this link because with little to no input from from shareholders generally, besides these proxy votes that they can have in terms of outing different directors on the board and things like that, it's very important to explore what actual voice these shareholders have in terms of keeping executive compensation in check. If managers and executives are simply exerting a disproportionate amount of influence over their total compensation, that isn't necessarily beneficial for shareholders, as these corporate profits, actually some research points out that 8% of all corporate profits go towards executive compensation. If those aren't being given to the shareholders, then they are losing out on incremental value that they could have if this executive compensation setting procedure were to be reformed moving forward. And third, lastly, this is going to have a pretty significant impact on the investment decisions that money managers can have. So for instance, if money managers can explore the link between a takeover defense being implemented and executives being compensated more highly, these firms might choose to not invest in these firms after they implement a takeover defense, because not only is it less likely that this firm is acquired and they get a payout in stock or in cash for their stock, it's also more likely that the corporate profits they would have been getting back in terms of the forms of dividends or stock buybacks, those are going to be significantly reduced because compensation is increasing much more rapidly than it would have been had this takeover defense not been implemented. So overall, executive compensation is a really, really interesting topic, and it's very nuanced in terms of there's a lot of moving parts of determining exactly what is influencing compensation in a given year. But with my findings, and finding that compensation or total compensation increases by 50% more after the implementation of a takeover defense, it seems significantly more likely that these managers are having a significant impact on their compensation in a given year. And so moving forward, it's going to be really interesting to explore what kind of reforms can be implemented by both regulators and stock exchanges in order to prevent this from happening in the future. Thank you.